All right, now we're going to be joined by Jean LaPierre from Matrox Video Systems, and he's going to be talking about IPMX timing. How different is it from ST2110? Take it away, Jean.
Hi, so Jean LaPierre, I'm Senior Director of Advanced Technologies for Matrox. And the talk that I'm going to do today is based on the work that we've been doing in the VSF IPMX working group. All right, so the goal of IPMX is to bring an open standard-based AV over IP protocol to the ProAV market. IPMX is based on ST2110, which is well-established open standard for AV over IP in the broadcast. And IPMX is basically looking to offer the same for the ProAV market. However, ProAV has some requirements and workflows that are sometimes a little different from broadcast market. Things like in ProAV, there's usually no house sync. A lot of signals are asynchronous in nature, like computer outputs. In ProAV, there's often very small network that wouldn't have any PTP. I mean, the extreme case of that in ProAV would be two devices connected directly with a Cat5 cable. We have to deal with things like RGB 444, 420, HDCP, which is content protection, EDID. And so in VSF working group, we're looking at how we can use SMPTE2110 and NMOS to address these various workflows. We want to make sure we have everything to build a truly open standard ecosystem. So today I'd like to concentrate on SMPTE ST2110 transport protocol itself. Other presenters will talk about some of the other efforts in the VSF IPMX working group. So when we got started on IPMX, we realized that there's many more things covered by SMPTE ST2110 specification than what is in use today. When people think of ST2110, they think of AV over IP transport protocol that's designed to carry signal that used to be carried by SDI cables and equipment in broadcast facility. Well, there's a good reason for that, because that's pretty much what it's being deployed today in ST2110 installation. But if you look at the SMPTE ST2110 specification, you will see that there's a lot more in there. Yes, of course, there's YUV, but there's also RGB in ST2110. There's 422, but there's 420, there's 444, there's 8, 10, 12, 16-bit. There's even 16-bit floating point in the specifications. So why do we need IPMX at all then, if all of that is already in 2110? Well, even though 2110 might cover how to support RGB 444 video, that's not what is commonly found in ST2110 equipment out there. So IPMX is targeting the ProAV workflows. So it's important for IPMX sender device, for example, one that would have an RGB 444 HDMI input, to understand that it has to generate an RGB IPMX network media stream when the monitor that's attached to the receiver is expecting RGB 444. So with IPMX, it's about putting all the pieces, making them come together to form a complete solution. For the rest of my presentation, I'd like to concentrate on things that are covered in ST2110-10 and -21. When we examine those part of ST2110, we noticed that some things needed to be clarified or made some tweaks to make them friendly to the ProAV workflow. Things are related to PTP, RTP timestamp, packet timing. So let's start with PTP. Some of the use cases in ProAV don't need PTP. When you need to install a handful of devices in a sports bar, chances are the equipment there is not going to include PTP Grandmaster. Of course, you could add one, and maybe one of your endpoint devices actually support that functionality. But if the workflow don't require it, why would you add the complexity of configuring PTP on that small network? So we need for IPMX to work without PTP. Actually, it might surprise you to know that in ST2110, PTP is, well, it's almost optional. Why do I say almost? It's because if you read the ST2110 specification, you'll find sentences like a common reference clock should be provided and distributed on a network by means of IEEE 1588. Well, you'll notice that it says it should, not shall. And by the way, IEEE 1588, well, that's basically what we call PTP. And so when ST2110 and IPMX talk about a common reference clock, that's also PTP we're talking about. And ST2110, you can also find pieces that say, well, if a common reference clock is unavailable, the device may signal use of the device internal clock and epoch. And so if you look at ST2110, at least part of it covers what to do when there is no PTP. So currently in ST2110 deployment pretty much always includes PTP. I would say that some ST2110 equipment out there actually will not work if there's no PTP on the network. In IPMX, we want to support network that have PTP and network that don't have PTP. So IPMX spells out what to do when there's no PTP. It says, use the internal clock as the reference and signal it in your SDP file, much like what is described in 2110 actually. But IPMX spells out, this is what you do. IPMX also says what to do when there is PTP. It says if the PTP is present, you have to use it. And by the way, use it exactly like an ST2110 device would use it. So what's different is we want IPMX to say that the devices to be an IPMX device means you shall support both of these modes. IPMX aims to be compatible with ST2110 that's already out there. So that's one of the reasons to support PTP. But PTP is also useful in some of the ProAV use cases. But like we saw, it's also important for IPMX to support simpler environment where PTP is not useful and would create unrequired complexity. So what's so special about ProAV? Well, most of the work in IPMX is centered around non-broadcast signals. And by non-broadcast signals, I'm thinking like signals like computer video and audio, consumer or prosumer HDMI cameras, all sorts of audio mixing consoles, projectors, things that are not typically used in broadcasts. In broadcasts, most signals are locked to the house sync. When they're not locked to the house sync, they're usually processed so they become locked to the house sync. And so we'll call those signals synchronous signals. In non-broadcast environment that are typical of ProAV, there's typically no house sync and signal are just free running. And we'll call those asynchronous signals. These asynchronous signals are what makes ProAV different, I think, from broadcast. So quick disclaimer, I'm more of a video guy. Most of the example in this talk will use video. This is because I find it simpler to illustrate my points that way. But most of what I will talk about also applies equally to audio. Also, you'll notice I use 25 frames per second in my video examples. And that's because it's actually easier. I find it easier to explain some of the things with 25 frames per second instead of using 29.97. But of course, it applies to all of these formats. So a synchronous signal is aligned in phase and frequency with the reference. And in ST2110, that reference is PTP. So typically in broadcast, your SDI signal are all synced to the house sync. And in an ST2110 facility, your house sync is synchronized with your PTP. And therefore, your SDI signal are synced to PTP. So in the example we see here, we see that the start of each frame lines up with the reference. We can also see that the frame rate frequency matches the reference. For our synchronous 25 frame per second signal, 1 second of video as measured using the reference clock has exactly 25 frames of video in it. In RTP protocol, the RTP clock is always derived from the media clock. And in this case of a synchronous video, the media clock is in sync with the reference. And this results in a special case where the RTP timestamps are directly related to your PTP clock. So in ProAV, usually there's no house sync. And so even if there is PTP on the network, computer signal, for example, will not be aligned to it. For our example, we can see that the start of frames don't always line up with the reference. We can also see that the frame rate frequency does not match the reference for our asynchronous 25 frames per second signal. 1 second of video, if measured using our reference clock, that doesn't correspond to 25 frames of video. In this example, it's more like 25.3 frames. So our video is actually coming in a little faster. In the case of asynchronous video, the media clock is out of sync with the reference. So in this case, the RTP timestamps do not have direct relationship to the RTP clock. And so let's review a little bit. IPMX and ST2110, they're both based on IETE RFC 3550. This is what talks about how to do RTP video. So the original IPMX proposal we started from was compatible with ST2110, but it actually broke compatibility with RFC 3550. So we had to rework a new method, which is actually compliant with RFC 3550 and with ST2110. SMPTE ST2110 targets mostly, like we saw, synchronous signals. It describes but does not mandate asynchronous signal support. In IPMX, we need to support both synchronous and asynchronous signals. So we follow the RFC 3550 for synchronous and when asynchronous signals are present. So let's look at what that means. So in RFC 3550, it explains that the media clock is synchronized to the input signal. So I have a video signal coming in or an audio signal coming in. My media clock is actually locked to that signal. The RTP timestamp are a sampling of that media clock. When RTP timestamp are derived from the PTP clock, like in the case of a synchronous video, all the media streams can be matched based on the RTP timestamp because all the RTP timestamp directly relate to the PTP clock, which is the common reference clock on your network. So basically I have two senders, they're sending me both videos, their timestamp, I can work out what time of day it means, what time it is in the common reference clock. When the RTP timestamp are not derived from the PTP clock, like in the case of a synchronous signal, as we saw, the RTP timestamp are meaningless in relation to streams that are coming from other senders because they're not directly related to this common reference clock. RTP timestamp, therefore, cannot be used to directly match media streams that come from various senders. So RFC 3550 actually comes to our rescue in this case. RTCP sender report offered a solution. Basically, an RTCP sender report is a message that says, oh, by the way, that RTP timestamp value corresponds to the reference clock value Z. And so with RTCP sender report, I can use that information to match the media stream to the reference clock. The RTP timestamp can be used indirectly, therefore, to match the media streams together. Meaning, if I have two senders and their RTP timestamp are not locked to the reference, but each sender is telling me, by the way, that timestamp was matches this time of the reference clock, I can use that info with the stream from another sender, use the RTP timestamp for the other sender, work it out what time it was for the CRC, and then match those streams. That information is also useful for a receiver in helping to lock to the sender signal. So in PTP-enabled ST2110 network with a synchronous source, an IPMX and a ST2110 sender will actually generate the same timestamps. Everything is based on the alignment point and no extra information is needed. However, in a PTP-enabled ST2110 network that has a synchronous signal, an IPMX sender will generate RTCP sender reports, and ST2110 might generate an RTCP sender report. And the reason I say might is because the asynchronous source support is not mandatory in ST2110. So as we can see, the timestamp in ST2110 and IPMX, they kind of work the same way, basically. So IPMX just mandates supports for RTCP sender reports to enable the better support of asynchronous signals. So where those are optional in ST2110. Let's talk about the traffic shaping model. This is probably the biggest difference between ST2110 and IPMX. ST2110, the traffic shaping is based on the fact that they deal with synchronous signals. In IPMX, the traffic shaping model targets asynchronous signal support, of course, but also low latency and small receiver buffer. We want to use small receiver buffer because we want to foster lower cost implementations. So let's review how traffic shaping works in ST2110. There's two parts to traffic shaping in 2110. The first part is called the network compatibility model. It's basically specify how bursty your signal can be on the network and still be a valid ST2110 signal. The idea is to avoid that all the transmitter would send all the packet in one big burst, because that would potentially create congestion on the network and you drop packet and it would overflow the network switch buffers. And so the second part that we're interested in for this discussion is what we call the virtual receiver model. This part describes the size of the receiver buffer that an ST2110 sender has to assume is present in the 2110 receiver. It describes when the sender should assume that the receiver will start emptying its receiver buffer. This is one place where ST2110 actually assumes that PTP is present on the network. The basic logic is, well, if you're a ST2110 sender, you have to be aware that the receiver will start to consume packet at the specified offset in time from the alignment points. This is called TR offset in these figures. And as a sender, you need to make sure that you send some packets to the receiver before that time or the receiver will actually start. A receiver has a minimum buffer size it needs to support in this model. And the specifications, the buffer cannot be smaller than this number. However, there's no information on how big that receiver buffer actually is. So the sender must assume that the buffer will be at least that size, but it can't assume it's going to be any bigger. And so what that results in is that the sender needs to make sure it doesn't start sending packets too early, because that would fill up the buffer and potentially overflow this receiver buffer. The virtual buffer model also includes two rates at which receiver can consume packets from the receiver buffer, linear and gap. Gap is basically means that the receiver will empty the receiver buffer during the active portion of the video, basically, and linear means it can empty it throughout the whole duration of the frame. By the way, the TR offset has a default value in the specification, but the ST2110 sender is allowed to say, well, my signal is offset differently, and it reports that in the SDP file. But still, that's still a static value for that signal. By its nature, the asynchronous signal, as we saw, has an offset from PTP that keeps varying continuously. And so the virtual receiver model based on a static offset does not work for the asynchronous signals.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Martin. Hi.
Okay, somebody's talking.
No, it's fine. No problem. It's a good time. Yeah.
Wes, can you mute this person?
Got it.
Thank you. All right, so virtual receiver buffer, asynchronous signal by nature, you can't really use this static offset model for receiver buffer. So IPMX solves this by using different virtual receiver model parameters. So in IPMX, what we say is we expect that the receiver will only start to empty its receiver buffer after a certain amount of packets are received. The amount chosen is related to the Cmax, which has to do with the burstiness of the sender. We also use the gap read schedule. For the network compatibility model, we use the wide equation from ST2110. And so, one benefit of this is that the timing of the first packet is not critical, right? The sender can send the first packet whenever it's ready. It's not critical because the receiver will not start to remove packet from its buffer until it has received a certain amount of packet. Of course, the sender still has to respect the gap read schedule and the Cmax, so it's not like it's gonna wait until the last line of video to do a huge burst. Gap was chosen because it enables the smallest latency possible. With a linear sender, the receiver would have to wait longer before it can start to render the packet onto the output video. It needs to compensate for the fact that the sender might be sending packets during the non-active portion of video. By the same token, using gap only enables receiver to use enable the receiver to use a smaller buffer, which enables less expensive implementation. So IPMX receiver must support a Cmax value that corresponds to type W. This is to make it easier for software senders implementation. And in a PTP enable ST2110 network with synchronous signals, the IPMX sender will be able to interoperate with ST2110 wide receivers. It's also important to note that IPMX sender can choose to limit their Cmax use to ST2110 type N and signal that in their SDP file. And this would enable the IPMX sender to be compatible with all ST2110 receiver, not just wide receivers. And of course, that it means they would also be compatible with every IPMX receiver. Because if you're a narrow sender, you're basically universally compatible with any receiver. If you're a narrow sender, sorry. So in my conclusion, we saw that ST2110 covers a lot more than what's actually in use. IPMX, we didn't need to reinvent everything. I would say in general, the way the IPMX specification work is that the ST2110 and RFC 3550, they describe how to do things. And things like, well, if you do RGB, this is how you do it. If you do YUV, this is how you do it, etc., etc. But IPMX clarify what needs to be done. So IPMX will say you must support PTP when it's there, and you must also work when there's no PTP, and you must support YUV, and you must support RGB, things like this. And so this is basically the concept behind IPMX. And as we saw, the timing is slightly different, but very, very similar. We mostly in IPMX say, well, this is how you work when PTP is there. This is how it work when it's not there. And the actual way of doing it is actually found in ST2110 specification. So, thank you. That's what I had today. Instead of going into my speaker room, I'll be in the IPMX discussion after this, like we mentioned. But if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to take them.
All right, Jean, thank you very much. Nice way of putting all that material together. So we do have about 4 minutes for questions here on the presentation stage. So if anybody has any questions, you can unmute or you can type something into the chat window. I'm also, again, reinforcing what Jean said, rather than going to the room that we have named in his honor, he's going to be going to the IPMX room immediately after he gets off the stage here. So if you want to go have a one-on-one chat with him or with a group, by all means, go over there and
Yeah, if you have
Chat
any
'em up.
question about IPMX in general, doesn't have to be about my discussion itself, my presentation type thing. We can talk about that. I can try to answer your questions about
Yeah,
IPMX.
I think you've got a pretty good view of all that stuff. You've been doing a lot of work on editing the IPMX specification within the VSF working group. So I think you know it pretty much. I think you probably know as much as anybody out there.
It's a group effort, but yeah, I try to understand it so I can see if what we're writing down makes sense and corresponds to, you know, what people are trying to put forward as how to deal with things. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, if you want to ask a question, just unmute and go ahead.